Hello, my name's Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is February 1st, and today is the 118th day since October 7th. There's two pieces of news that are hot off the press. One happened just at 8 p.m. in Jerusalem on Thursday evening. And today is Thursday. I'm recording this at about 2 p.m. East Coast time. According to the Times of Israel, we might be on the precipice of a temporary ceasefire. Qatar's foreign ministry has announced that Hamas has given an initial positive confirmation of a proposed deal that would see hostages freed and fighting in Gaza stop, at least for a period of time. It says Israel has also agreed to the proposal, confirming reports that Jerusalem okayed the deal in negotiations at Paris this past Sunday. So this is news coming out of, we've talked this past week about the Paris agreement. The meeting in Paris succeeded in consolidating proposals. The proposal has been approved by the Israeli side, and now we have an initial positive confirmation from the Hamas side. This is according to Majid al-Ansari. He said this referring to meetings between Qatari, U.S., Israeli, and Egyptian officials in Paris this weekend. But according to some Israeli officials, they've said that they did not agree to the deal. You might recall the Paris agreement would call for a first phase of civilian hostages being released, taking place over a period of 6 weeks of a pause. And there would be Palestinian prisoners, 3 Palestinian prisoners held by Israel, released for every civilian hostage. That's the same ratio that was in the former hostage exchange. So for every hostage released from Gaza, there would be 3 Palestinian prisoners released. That ratio would be expected to go up for the Israeli Defense Forces soldiers. So for every soldier, there would be a higher number of Palestinian prisoners released. And a longer pause would be possible after the 6 weeks, and then there would be later phases. The Paris Agreement is a melding of different proposals that we've been hearing about from Israel, Hamas, Qatar, and Egypt, along with additional ideas from the United States. The proposals have differed in the length of the pause. We've heard anything from 1 month to more, and then the ratios, the swapping of prisoners and hostages. So our prayers and our hope that might go through, but that's news in that regard. The second hot off the press news is that President Biden has issued an unprecedented executive order aimed at punishing Israeli settlers. These are Jewish communities in the occupied Palestinian territories, aimed at punishing Israeli settlers in the West Bank who have attacked Palestinian civilians. The executive order initially targets 4 specific Israeli settlers who've been indicted for violence, during which their assets in the United States will be frozen. Biden's order further allows the U.S. to impose sanctions on additional individuals and leaders of any entity, including government officials, targeting Palestinian civilians, whether through violence, intimidation, property damages, or terror. The State Department put out an announcement this afternoon that says further measures to promote peace, security, and stability in the West Bank. They talked about consistently opposing actions that undermine stability in the West Bank, including the attacks by settlers against Palestinians and also Palestinian attacks against Israelis. They said there's no justification for extremist violence against civilians, whatever their national origin, ethnicity, or religion. And they talked about this executive order specifically. And they said that Israel must do more to stop violence against civilians in the West Bank and to hold accountable those who are responsible for it. The United States will continue to take actions to advance the foreign policy objectives of the United States, including the viability of the two-state solution, and is committed to the safety, security, and dignity of Israelis and Palestinians alike. So that's 2 big pieces of news. I wanted to thank everyone who joined our live briefing this morning. It was the first time I've been able to join in a few weeks. I gave a summary of several pieces of news, that have happened over the past week, including the decision by the International Court of Justice, ruling largely in favor of South Africa's indictment of Israel. The ICJ ruled that Israel's actions in Gaza could potentially constitute a genocide. They called on Israel to take all measures to avoid acts of genocide, and they stopped just short of calling for a ceasefire. Of course, also significant news over the weekend was that U.S. troops were attacked on a base in Jordan near the border of Syria. 3 U.S. service members were killed and 36 more were injured. President Biden has vowed that the U.S. would respond, but he also committed to not further escalating violence and war in the Middle East. We don't yet know what the U.S. response will be. And then other significant news was that the UN Refugee Agency of UNRWA lost significant funding this week. Israel alleged that some staff members of UNRWA were involved in the October 7th attacks, and UNRWA immediately let those staff members go and started an investigation. Churches for Middle East Peace and other organizations have joined us in calling for the reinstatement of that funding. UNRWA is the #1 provider of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, which is so desperately needed in these days. And we know that children are the most affected by war and by violence. I shared these statistics before, but I just want to reiterate, children make up more than half of the population of Gaza. More than the population there is 2.3 million people, and their lives have just been brutally shattered by war. And while Israel has stated that it is striving to avoid civilian casualties, more than 11,500 children under the age of 18 have been killed since October 7th, and thousands more have been injured. And while we don't know the exact number, according to the nonprofit agency of the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor, more than 24,000 children have lost one or both of their parents because of the bombing and the incursion into Gaza. And children are the ones that are the most affected by war and by violence. And I've been waiting to kind of talk about this, but one night this week, the Israeli embassy hosted an event as a part of a summit here in Washington, D.C. And I was invited to attend a screening of a film that you might have heard of. It was a film that was a compilation of videos from the October 7th attacks. And I felt like I in good conscience couldn't not watch. I had no desire to see what had happened, but because of my work and because of my commitment to peace, I fundamentally believe in a multi-narrative approach. I felt like I had to bear witness. And so I watched. The film was more than 45 minutes long, and I saw snapshots of the atrocities that happened that day. There were more than 300 members of Hamas and other militant groups that brutally attacked 30 Israeli towns and kibbutzim and the Re'im music festival. And for the rest of my life, I will never forget the images that I witnessed. And we've heard it said, that day was the most significant number of Jews killed since the Holocaust, the highest number of deaths. And that's true. And a number of other people, Palestinian citizens of Israel also, and other internationals, but the brutality and the massacre and it was one of the most horrific things I've ever seen. And words cannot describe the horror of that day. And I will carry those images with me for the rest of my life. And we were asked when we watched that video to bear witness. And I left the screening of that film all the more committed to the work that I do. And all the more committed to calling for a ceasefire. Because violence is not the answer, and the further oppression of the Palestinian people will not bring justice to the brutal murders of those innocent people that day. And the murders of the people who died on October 7th, they were brutal. And I'm sorry that I condemned the Hamas attacks on October 7th, but I had no idea it was as brutal as it was. And so I'm sorry that I wasn't more outspoken about how horrific. And I've said time and time again, one horror does not minimize another horror. So as we talk about never again, the cry of never again must be heeded for every Jewish man, woman, and child in Israel and around the world. And for every Palestinian child. And so I bear witness for every life lost on October 7th. And I say, may their memory be a blessing. For every man, woman, and child that was taken hostage, for those that remain hostage, I am still committed. I've been saying, the 1 minute a day, let's call for hostages to be returned home immediately. And, and for Palestinian prisoners, there are so many political prisoners who are fighting for freedom who should be released. But also, we also need to bear witness for every man, woman, and child in Gaza who has been innocently killed by a bomb, who has died because they were in a building or a church or maybe even a school that was attacked or blown up. And so for every Jewish life and every international life lost on October 7th, and for every civilian who has lost their life, might we bear witness and might we say, may their memory be a blessing. The death toll in Gaza right now is at 27,019 men, women, and children. And there are also hundreds more from the West Bank. And I say, may their memories be a blessing. And I also say, may God have mercy on us. And might we demand that this killing stop. And a comprehensive ceasefire is the only answer. The Gospel of Matthew, Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, he said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And we have to lift up, there are some incredible, incredible people in Israel and in Palestine and all around the world, who are saying we have to stand up and stop the killing in Gaza and stop the oppression and occupation of the Palestinian people and stop anti-Semitism and call October 7th what it was, an absolute horror of horrors. And so I say, blessed are the peacemakers. And so we have to lift up the people in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories who are calling for a ceasefire, who are calling for an end to war and death and destruction, because that is the most important work we can do in this moment. Call for an end to war, call for a ceasefire, for the sake of every life that has been lost, for every child that has lost one or more parent, for every hostage, for every political prisoner. And may God go before us in our efforts. Amen.